Hi, Anne-Marie. Welcome to Safeguarding Matters. Something really important to come up. So there is the independent inquiry to child sexual abuse, which focused on the residential schools report. They came up with 7 recommendations. So I thought we could go through those recommendations. Are you ready for them?
I am.
So the first one, recommendation 1, is they're saying that all schools should be inspected under the same standard as children's homes and as normal schools. So basically they're saying that independent schools could have been done a different way. And they want to make sure that they're introducing something for guardians, so that make sure all guardians are registered on the DBS system. What do you think about that recommendation?
Music to my ears, because the first thing about residential homes, so I worked in lots of children's homes as a social work student, and my mother was a foster carer in the sense of when I was a teenager, so I was familiar with foster care too. And I do know with children in the looked after or the children in care system, there is meaning you're residing with the family overnight and becoming part of that family, rather than day school, go home and only come back. So there's lots of risk in the sense of parental responsibility, in accountability, decision making, as well as the famous parental responsibility PR in the sense of consent. 2, peer on peer harm. To lots of things where you are in charge of somebody else's child, in the sense of you should be more alert rather than more relaxed because that child So the fact that they are bringing in higher standards in relation to residential is good for me, because there'll be things there that they really will be deep dived in the sense, because when I do reviews, safeguarding reviews for boarding schools, quite a lot of the dormitory stuff come up in the safeguarding review. Example being supervision during the night. Things like in the sense of staff's availability, how close are you to the room, to showering, to the toileting, to all of that. So there's an element of that. And I think also, likewise, you are a school. So clearly there's the kind of aspect of still keeping it around inspection for schools, but also residential, which is so different. So I'm glad to hear that. And I think the final bit about guardians, for about 8 years now, I've been, you might remember AGIS, the Association of Independent Guardianships for Education, international students, and I know that I've done some work with them from day one, looking at, they were very unhappy about that sort of sector being unregulated, very unhappy about anyone can be that, and they try to bring in their own principles around it and standards, and they've done it very well, and they've been lobbying for years. So when they first did their work, the LADO wasn't even aware of the reality of international students being in the UK. So you're absolutely right. I think there is, something around, we used to call them the lost children that, they're not on any data, in the sense of when they come into the country, yes, they're on the school system, but not in any national data. So I think there is definitely scope for more protection. There's lots of vulnerabilities around international students, from fitting in, people pleasing, in the sense of trying to blend into a society where they want to be accepted, especially children in their peer groups.
I mean, we used to find, not now, but a long time ago, we found that the guardians used to be an older brother or sister who happened to be at university down the road, which obviously is not a suitable guardian, because, say they went to stay at their university digs, sleep on the floor, that's not a conducive environment at all. So we put that quite into place, but there's nothing legally stating that a guardian has to be something. So this is a really good recommendation. The second one is that they want to introduce a set of national standards for ALADO to promote consistency, and then they want to clarify guidance for LADOs for concerns and allegations. Now, to me, that doesn't seem a boarding school thing. That seems what everyone should be doing in every school. So that seems odd in there.
So maybe in me interpreting that in this inquiry in the LADO role, because I was a LADO for 4 years in education. So I know, for example, it took me time to understand what tutors do in their sector. So does the LADO, actually understand the boarding school sector in the sense of house parents, you know what I mean? Host families, to all of that in the reality, because they know foster carers, obviously, but they wouldn't be aware of the kind of niche market you have.
True.
So I think it's the LADO understanding 100% what a boarding school would look like in any you know, the expectations of, for example, behaviors of a house parent to peer-on-peer harm, you know, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Okay. Number 3 is focused on governors, really, and they're trying to say that governors are, they've got 3 key things they want governors to have: openness to external scrutiny, transparency and honesty with the governors. So what they're trying to say is that governors know exactly what's going on in the boarding house and can question it. That's what they're trying to say. That's quite a nice one. I like that.
Yes, and again, that complements IICSA 22, that we know governors have also stepped up around safeguarding training, etc. And you're absolutely right. So for years I've been saying, doing audits, I always see it's got better, but not as good as, where the accountability scrutiny sits in with the strategic board. And a lot of those strategic boards take the word of the SLT at face value. There's no challenge.
I haven't looked around the boarding house.
Absolutely. So I've done some troubleshooting recently where things have gone wrong, and in going in, it's so interesting that 99.9% of this was down to accepting something on face value on a trusted person who was doing a fantastic job. But the people who were doing that and accepting it were not aware of the subject, therefore reliant on that information, rather than actually you're missing something here. So that's so interesting. And I'm glad to again see another bit where they are empowering and upskilling, you know, or trustees or boards.
The next one is about training and awareness. They specifically focus on being aware that PSHE and sex ed and things like that could have a different impact to vulnerable students and boarders. So they're really trying to push that, all right, schools have got to do this whole new criteria, but you could have some students from Hong Kong, who could have some students who've got a completely different culture background to it. So that was quite an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. And on the back of that, when new students start, you know, we've got to think about, especially from another country, the reality of the cultural, you know, the cultural environment, the contextual stuff that happen that they might think is just normal in the UK. So, you know, they could be targeted, you know, in the sense of you fitting in, that's what we do, this is normal, to not understanding language, even to the point, Kerry, where not understanding the private parts in the sense of, you know, someone's never ever had to talk about it before. And then all of a sudden there's
from a different starting point to our
could be religious, absolutely, could be awkward. So we just got to think about the silence of it, and in cases looking at what do we need to be doing to be more proactive. So definitely peer-on-peer harm to consider, definitely the kind of new people coming into an existing culture of the school culture, but as well as the country, society and all the other bits. So I'm glad to see that as well in inductions, I'd imagine, and training.
Recommendation 5 is a little bit more vague. It's basically saying schools are required to tell inspectors if they have referred a member to the DBS barring system, which of course schools have to do anyway. And then include the national standards for the LADO. So it seems something that I reckon that's in the Keeping Children Safe. So I don't really know why that's been...
I think that's much more about open transparency again, because don't forget, Kerry, we've had from September 21, we now talk about low-level concerns that don't go to the LADO, and then the ones that go to the LADO. So I believe I would read that as that's more about any concerns that have been raised. Hence talking to the inspectors about it, rather than only the LADO threshold ones.
And that links to number 6, which is really focused on volunteers, because of course with boarding houses, we get lots of volunteers, but they're not necessarily volunteers. So they could be the husband of the boarding house mistress, who's not a teacher but happens to live in the accommodation. Do you see what I'm saying? So they're really...
He'd be DBS, right?
Sorry?
He would be DBS'd.
Yes, he would, and he'd have a contract. A really clear kind of job description, even though he probably didn't have a job, but it'd be like really clear of, you can't go into this bit of the boarding house and things like that. But they're counting him as a volunteer, because his DBS would be a volunteer DBS because he's not being paid, or she, but they're obviously really honing in on this extra bit. So it's people that don't actually have a role in the boarding house, but maybe live in the boarding house. So they're really, so that was the last recommendation that they had.
That's interesting, because I also can see the safeguarding part of that. So obviously there's been scenarios where, in hearing that, it sounds as if there's been cases where maybe a relative or somebody in that family of being the past parent could have had an inappropriate something with somebody within the setting.
Yeah.
So going back to volunteer role profiles, when we mentioned safeguarding, going back to staff handbooks or handbooks for volunteers, or, you know, handbooks for house families, you know, one could argue, a bit like foster carers, it's the same, where, for example, walking around in a dressing gown would be inappropriate, you know, in the sense of there's different types of dressing gowns, isn't there, Kerry, right?
Mine's fine.
You know, the long, silky, thick, fluffy, you know, to see through. So the little things like that, you know, based on around children.
Yeah, no.
You know.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Bye-bye.